Gotta find someplace.
All right, thanks. Sorry for the wait, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. We'll commence the third Town Board workshop concerning the application of Scanel for an amendment to the PDD. So, Stu, thank you very much for your memo, particularly helpful for distinguishing technical comments from determinations of completeness. Thanks very much, and thanks to everybody else for the information you've given to the board. All right, so let's pick
Darren,
up
can I
where
just
we
have
left
a second?
Sure.
I just want to first of all say sorry that I missed the party last week. I know that everybody has spent a lot of time and energy and money on this project, and it's important. I want you to know that I certainly respect all your time. I also want to say a special thank. Fortunately, was able to, of course, watch the video, and thanks to Stu and Tom for offering what I found to be a lot of clarity to issues that are very complicated. So, thank you. Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, Cynthia. Okay, so why don't we pick up kind of where we left off? Stu, is there anything else that you want to add to the memo from yesterday?
No, I don't think so. I wonder if Leah wants to say anything, because I know she's drafted a resolution that would incorporate what we hope are the board's completeness comments, pending any questions or comments. I don't know if Leah, you wanted to add anything to that.
So do we have everything that we've discussed? I mean, we've had comments from Creighton Manning and Shazen, members of the town board, and Stillwater, right?
Right, we've not included, sorry, we've not included each and every comment that's
Right.
been made. What we've included are those comments that we and Chazen believe are appropriate for completeness,
Yep.
as opposed to technical.
Technical comments,
But yes,
right.
we've included everything that We've included comments from Chase and comments from the town of Stillwater, comments from Global Foundries Engineers, and comments from Councilman Hartzell.
Okay, got
And
it.
you didn't include mine, right?
What, I'm
Oh,
sorry?
oh, I saw that.
And some of them would have been combined, you know.
Technical.
Yeah, they're in there. Yeah. Okay, yes, we have that resolution, and the board, you know, has had a chance to look at it. And so I think the board will be considering tonight, you know, whether to, you know, adopt that resolution.
Right, and the other thing we just wanted to mention is this is obviously your resolution. It's in draft form. If you want to add to it, detract from it, it's entirely up to the board.
Yep. Got it. Okay, we'll open it up to the town board. Are there any questions, or would you like to go right to the resolution? Do we have discussions beforehand? John?
I have some that might save time if I can.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I'm referring to primarily Stu's memo and the adopted scope. Some of these are, you know, questions, and others are points, I guess. As folks know, I raised this issue about the need to evaluate the impact of, on traffic of simultaneous construction of 8.2 and the Scanell proposal. And I guess when Chazen went back and looked at this a little more detail, you determined that construction impact hadn't been, of 8.2 hadn't been evaluated, and it was kicked down the road till, I guess, site plan approval. Is that what I, okay. So in, so that we can understand how that would be addressed at that point, would the planning board have to undertake some further supplemental seeker evaluation at that time, or do they have the power as part of their site plan, you know, town law 274 or whatever is site plan approval authority to require that further analysis?
The latter, the seeker finding for 8.2 deferred it to the site plan.
Okay.
And as a practical matter here, remember, this is an application for a zoning change. We don't know what might ultimately be built if you were to approve it. And so necessarily, I think the same would apply to any future project that came about as a result of this zoning change, should you approve it. And I think, and to your point, if they both happen at approximately the same time, then the planning board is going to have to look at it that way.
My understanding of the GIS, you know, and I have to preface everything I say almost with, you know, which may or may not be true or accurate, is that as long as a project comes along that fits within the parameters, the seeker record, no further seeker analysis is required for the action to be taken by that body in the future. That's always been my understanding of a GIS. With that kind of general understanding, hopefully being accurate, if all of a sudden there's a new impact identified that's beyond what is established as an assumed impact in the GIS, it's got to be
Correct.
secret. Yeah.
That's correct.
All right.
And,
Okay.
and that could apply to almost anything.
Yep.
Right.
So it could apply here.
It could
It
apply to
could.
almost anything.
They could be required to do traffic impact analysis. If
There are certain thresholds, sorry to interrupt you, John, there are certain thresholds for requiring a supplemental EIS. And essentially, you're quite right. If there are things that weren't studied that appear to rise to the level of a significant impact, then they could require a supplemental EIS.
Otherwise, they would nonetheless have power to require information be provided as part of the site plan review process? Is that legally they had that power?
Yes.
Okay. The other thing that I kind of Again, this effort has been one where you think you understand something, and then you realize that you don't, and then maybe you do. And so I've gone back and forth a number of times on this issue of the applicant seems to be wanting to have authority to build to a certain level, but is only providing impact analysis to fit within the existing seeker record. That's what I keep seeing, and I'm struggling because I'm looking at our scope document that says they have to analyze impacts to the extent of their amendment, not the extent of the existing seeker record. Am I crazy in terms of seeing that presented in the material we have?
I wouldn't characterize it the way that you have.
You wouldn't use crazy.
I didn't say that. Remember when Tom gave the discussion of what they're working against right now? You have a generic environmental impact statement that limits the number of trips that can come out of the park. We don't, we've asked for quite a bit of additional information to verify all of that, and we don't have to go into those details now. They've provided a table of potential land uses that can fit within the zoning amendment and tied that to trip generation. And so there is likely 3.5 million square feet of something, and I don't have the table right in front of me, that could fit within those trip thresholds. There are different land uses that might have much higher trip generation characteristics, a high cube warehouse, where you wouldn't get the 3.5 million. It really is dependent on trips, not the square footage.
So, what I want them to analyze is if they build the most demanding development in terms of traffic capacity that would be authorized by the PDD language itself. That's what I want to see. I want to see the traffic impact of that.
Well, I think that, go ahead.
Because that's the action. Our action is to rezone, to allow them a capacity to develop to the maximum extent within the code. And I'm not sure why we're not insisting that they analyze to that level.
Because the seeker analysis that they're doing limits them to a certain number of trips. They're not asking for unlimited trips at 3.5 million square feet. They're asking for trips within the thresholds you've previously adopted, and they're limiting themselves in that way.
So to that point, John, if I could, I think that's sort of where my head was going with this. That is the ultimate limiting factor, is that there is a trip threshold, regardless of square footage built, regardless of use built, that no matter what this action this board takes regarding use and the amendments, there's still a hard threshold
Correct.
that a project can't exceed.
Correct.
So that whether they decide to build 3.5 million square feet of toy manufacturing or whatever, it's the threshold is the threshold regardless.
Well, to the point we were just talking about, that would not be true were they to come in before our planning board with some kind of site plan for a more extensive development with greater traffic demands, and they could do supplemental seeker review at that point, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, that's exactly how it would work. If somebody came in, just as we're doing now in a sense, they want to do something that's not authorized, then guess what? We're going to have to do seeker some more.
Would we maintain our status as lead agency so that it could not be conducted before the planning board?
Yeah, yeah, yes.
So the town board would have to approve it, not the planning board.
The process this board went through to redesignate yourselves as lead agency for this purpose is exactly what you'd go through the next time if that situation arose. So
the-
yeah, and we would recommend to the planning board that it not take action on whatever site plan application was then at issue, and that it refer it to the town board to conduct SEQA review.
Okay.
So they come in with a proposal. Let's say this was approved and they did the zoning change, and then a prospective buyer or tenant at one of the areas that's covered by this PDD application comes in and says, well, we want to do X. And X would result in many more trips than we have. They'd have to go through the secret analysis, and this board could say no or yes if you put a roundabout at East Line or something like that, right?
Right, I don't know if you want this level of detail, but when an applicant comes before the planning board, our planners provide a staff review document to the planning board members, and SECRA is one of the components of that staff review. Under this situation that you're mentioning, Supervisor, what we'd have is the staff review saying the proposed action exceeds the thresholds of the previous SECRA review, rather than what it normally says, which is the proposed action falls within the thresholds of the townwide GEIS and statement of findings. That would prompt this board, that would prompt the applicant to come before this board. It would prompt this board to redesignate yourselves as secret lead agency, and then you would go through a process exactly what we're doing here, because what we're doing here is a supplemental EIS. You would do the exact same process. You'd consider whether there are any new or different impacts that have not been properly considered during other SECRA review efforts. If so, you'd identify them. You'd likely adopt a scope, or you'd go through the scoping process, and then we'd be doing this exact exercise after at that point, 5th supplemental draft GEIS is submitted. And that's exactly the process we're going through right now.
Okay.
Can I just add one thing really quick?
Sure.
So I think the one thing I just want to remind folks of is as we've applied and proposed the amendment right now, and as it's been drafted, the trip counts are actually codified in the PDD amendment. So the additional step we'd have to take is we'd have to apply for another PDD amendment, or future users would, because it wouldn't just be a site plan submittal. It'd have to be an actual change to the zoning bylaw.
A very good point. So our planners would likely not only classify this as exceeding the threshold of the GEIS, they'd also identify it as exceeding the allowance under the zoning law. In other words, that, a zoning amendment would be needed. That's a very good point. Thank you.
And you will, if you were to approve this, you would make findings to all this, to all this effect.
I had not too many more, but I don't want to cut somebody off if they're.
Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, John.
It was a little bit difficult to, so we got this resolution this morning with this list of stuff in it. I've got my 6 pages from, a week and a little bit more ago. I've got previous, list of completeness comments from Chazen. I've got Chazen's evaluation of Global Foundries, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure everything, I couldn't double check all this stuff to make sure what was in and what wasn't in. And this was one thing that when I saw the memo from which I appreciate the effort that went into responding to my points, I had raised some concern about the fact that the scope that we adopted on utilities, it says, the scope is to identify the projected demands for electric, water, sanitary, sewer, and gas service, and compare the projected demands with the projections stated in the original LFTC GEIS. And I didn't find where the draft supplemental GEIS had done that. I could have missed it because, we're swimming around in paperwork and computer files. But I didn't see it. So I did see there separately, the scope separately requires discuss any utility expansions or improvement. And then it goes on to say scope also including obtaining will-serve letters. And then when I looked at Chazen's response to my concern that the projected demands weren't specified, the response was the scope requires inclusion of will-serve letters. It said nothing about meeting the requirement in the scope for projected demands in a comparison with prior projections. And then I went to Leah's draft resolution, and that's just a little bit different on this point. she doesn't address the issue, which I think is pretty clear here in the scope of projected demands. In your, I guess, starting down, Leah, at 14, you get into utilities, but again, I don't see anything that speaks to the scope requirement that there be projected demands for utilities in comparison of those demands with prior projected demands. So again, with so many pieces of paper going around, I'm trying to compare these things, and I don't see where my concern about the absence of projected demands is addressed.
It's a good question. In our parlance, the will serve letter addresses that, because the idea is to get a will serve letter, you have to ask, you have to present those demands and ask for it. But I take your point that you want it to be explicit, so why don't we add language to number 14 that contains the exact language out of the scope? That, like I say, in our view, the will serve letter asks for that, but maybe that's a little, inside baseball. So why don't we add that language to 14?
Okay, fair enough.
So you're only talking about gas and electric, right, John?
No, I'm talking
Gas,
about all
electric, water,
of
and
them.
sewer.
Okay, so 13 and 14 then. So we'd be adding it to both those paragraphs, right?
I'm almost done, if people can believe that.
While John's looking at his papers, I can just say, I think some members of this board, me in particular, have a concern with, one, we have two wonderful possibilities for the campus. Global Foundries 8.2, obviously, and Scannell's application here. The problem is we have this limited number of trips that could be swallowed up by one of them and then pose a big problem to the other one in terms of mitigation. So, that's at least a big concern of mine, and I think probably some of the other members of the board. But that's just a general comment. John, are you ready?
Yeah, I've just got a few more, and I appreciate everyone's patience. On the archaeological, on page, I'm not clear on what level of, study has to be completed at this stage. Because when I look at, I had this straight when I wrote it at whatever, in the middle of the night, but I've long since forgotten it. The archaeological analysis identifies the need for a phase 2 study of LF9 and 1B study of the impact area of Pod 5. It identifies that those things need to happen based on the application and assumed development of those areas. And I'm not understanding why that analysis is not required now. We seem to be kicking that analysis, those studies down the road. Why do we have to do all this analysis of other issues like traffic, like the visual impact analysis, but this archaeological stuff can be kicked down the road? I'm not clear on that.
Well, we're not kicking it very far down the road. It's going to be asked in technical. We can't get to findings without addressing that. I'm simply looking at what the scope said. And the scope didn't say to do those particular studies now, but it's going to be a technical comment, because I don't think we can get to the end of this process without having those questions answered. So it's not it's a little tap of the pebble, John, but it's not a
Okay.
deferring it.
In terms of that, and we might, unfortunately, on account of being a lawyer, I'm always inclined to find reasons to argue over things, but, so the, one man's technical is another man's completeness, but, so I would respectfully disagree on some of your conclusions on it, but that aside, the technical review process, which would start, I guess, once we've deemed the DGEIS or SDGEIS complete, who's paying, some of these studies, like that phase 2 and phase 1B studies, that's not inexpensive. That's, money out of pocket. Who's paying for that?
The applicant.
Okay. So we're gonna be waiting for, and the ground will be frozen, of course, by the time we get there, and,
Who knows?
yeah, so we'll be waiting for that stuff to conclude before we can do a final
Correct.
supplement.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and just to be very clear, what the scope said was to confirm that the previous cultural resources studies included the area for the proposed action. It's confirmed that they did not. So when we get to technical review, we're gonna say, okay, now you gotta complete the relevant cultural resource studies, and you need to have that in hand before you get to a final EIS and make findings.
Okay.
It can't be deferred until afterwards.
If they can't do, I forget, but I think one of these talked about you need to do this many test pits or something, right? You know, if they're not able to do that until April,
They'll have to wait.
we're gonna be sitting here till April.
Correct.
Okay. That's a piece of information I didn't.
Well, you know, it's, since we do a lot of field work ourselves, our field work season has gotten longer and longer over the recent years.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the ocean's rising higher and higher.
Stu, since the board might be voting on this resolution tonight, can we agree on the language that you'd like to add to 13 and 14?
Go ahead, Kathy.
If, we'll just do 13 because it'll be the same for 14.
Okay.
If the period is changed to a comma, and then identify project demands and compare with projections as stated in original LFTC GEIS.
Okay, and the same language in
In 14.
paragraph 14.
No problem.
Okay,
I'm almost done, Darren.
Okay.
Again, thanks everyone for their patience. I mean, some of these, it would just be an argument about technical versus completeness, but frankly, if the project sponsor is gonna have to do the work anyways at their expense before we get done, I guess that might be an argument not worth having. The one thing I just hope is not lost, because I think I have the accumulation of a lot of knowledge, a lot of which is useless, not interesting, and I can't make any money with it. So, but I want to pass it along. The one thing I'm not sure everybody realizes is that all the assessed value that Global Foundries has over there does nothing for us on sales tax. It does not count in the county's distribution of sales tax to the town of Malta. And the reason is because the IDA has title to the property. And I would believe, based on my decades of being around this sort of thing, that any project, in fact, I was a proponent of, much to the former supervisor's chagrin, of amending the PDD originally had a prohibition in it of any project obtaining any payment in lieu of tax benefit for the development of the project. And I, over great resistance of Paul Sausville, got the town board to change that. And so what happens is that assessed value, chances are, as these things go, the projects would develop. They won't be on the taxable portion of the rolls. We'll get no credit towards sales tax on that value that happens in there. So the number of these conclusions about, for instance, that we're going to achieve an increase in our amount of our percentage of sales tax because of development of projects in there, likely just not accurate. And there's a number of things like that, but I'll happily revisit them should we be still working on this in months hence, I guess, in the technical review part of the discussion. So thank you very much for your patience and your help. That's all I have.
well, that's certainly an interesting issue. And in fact, Mark and I were talking about that today. I mean, if the town of Malta is devoting a significant portion of its commercial possibilities to the campus, and none of that is included in the algorithm to determine sales tax allocation. That hurts us because, you know, with traffic effects and everything, such a large portion of our commercial possibilities is concentrated in the campus, whereas other towns, it's not, and their, you know, their commercial property gets counted in the sales tax formula. So, I mean, that is a problem from where I sit.
I guess I don't really quite understand why that's true. I mean, Global Founders is a different animal because, of course, they were, you know, developed under a pilot and stuff like that. But, so what you're saying is that if the Scanel project moves forward, that also does not contribute to our assessed value for,
Yeah,
and why is that?
I mean, what would happen in almost every case where you have a project that's significant like this, you have to look at the IDA's, you know, payment in lieu of tax policy. But many projects of the nature that would go into the tech campus would qualify for a property tax abatement. And what happens is the way that is brought into effect is the IDA becomes the owner usually,
Okay.
or has a leasehold or a licensed interest in the property. By virtue of that, it comes out of the taxable portion of the assessment rolls. It becomes exempt. They make a payment in lieu of taxes, but it's nonetheless in the exempt portion of the tax
Right.
rolls. And
So it doesn't increase
by
our
law,
assessed value.
only for purposes of sales tax distribution,
Right.
because by law, under the tax law, the allocation of sales tax among the towns has to be based on taxable assessed value. Right? And it's a, you know, folks don't, you know, there's lots of arguments can be made, but you know, the assessed value of Global Foundries was in the range of $500 million at one point. And think how much we would have benefited from, you know, from that. You know, but everybody gave, at the time, right, the county gave the water project to make it happen. Others gave other things. That was the sacrifice the town of Malta made to make Global Foundries happen. So, but anyways, just in terms of the technical issue in
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that would have to be addressed at some point. I mean, you know, in terms of the water, yeah, but the water authority has paid back just about all of its, you know, debt to the county and paid its bonds, and I mean, they're doing very well, frankly.
and the county, you know,
You
in
know.
fairness, the county took the roads over from us.
Yeah, that's
also,
true.
You know, took that burden off us. So there's different arguments you can make, but just you know, I pass along for what it's worth.
Yeah, we'd have to do a comparison with other towns and make sure Malta was being dealt with fairly, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously something that we're going to want to make sure we remain close with the county
Right.
on that issue. The one thing, though, I do want to make sure that we note is, you know, if this project doesn't go forward, that land doesn't get developed and there's still no impact on our taxable value. In fact, you know, my concern is that the remaining property at LFTC has a pretty significant lien against it by the state of New York. And if we don't have a project of some magnitude come forward and be brought to fruition, we do at some point run the risk of having the state of New York become the single largest property owner in the town of Malta. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing for any resident or taxpayer. So I think that, you know, we got to view all this in, you know, really in 180 and make sure that we understand all sides of it and remain close to the county. But, you know, that's obviously a lot of things we got to take into consideration as we look at the financial impact.
All right. If there's no further questions or comments from the board or from you, Stu.
Darren, with just one, if I could.
Sure.
The point Tim just made is one Darren and I have talked about, and I think that, you know, in theory, the state of New York has a mortgage on the property in the tech campus, other than the Global Foundries property and the roads and some common areas. But my own view is that, and they've had the Luther Force Tech Campus, which is the debtor that owes the $10 or $12 million, whatever it is. They haven't paid it as was required. And the state has not foreclosed on its mortgage. In my own humble opinion, you know, which is worth not much, is that the state won't foreclose because they have the best of both worlds now. They have absolute control over what happens with the property because they have a mortgage lien on it. and they don't have to own it. I don't think the state's going to be in any great rush to foreclose on its mortgage, because when they did, they would have to assume the obligations of being a property owner when they effectively control the property right now.
My concern is not foreclosure, it's the solvency of LFTC on an ongoing basis. And, you know, with no revenue coming in for a very long time and a lot of money going out the door for a very long time and no prospect of actually selling their assets, that is a grave concern from where I sit. That not that the state will foreclose, although the state has threatened foreclosure in the past. I'm not concerned immediately that the state will foreclose, but rather should financial circumstances cause LFTC to go bankrupt or in some way dissolve. My understanding is that the property would revert to the state of New York, and I don't see a lot of great prospects for LFTC. I mean, if there were, some of this property probably would have been developed sometime between the mid-2000s and today, over these 15-plus years of trying to develop this tech park. So, you know, I'm not suggesting the state's going to come in and foreclose tomorrow, although they have threatened to do so. I'm more concerned about the long-term viability of a broke nonprofit that owns an awful lot of property in the town of Malta.
Just so that for history, not to argue with Tim, but we had many years ago a discussion about that concern, brought bankruptcy counsel in at the time, and because Luth Forest Tech Campus is a not-for-profit corporation, they can't be forced involuntarily into bankruptcy. And usually with a nonprofit, there's very little incentive for them to go into bankruptcy because they can't be forced into it. There's very little you can do to them. So they would typically have more staying power than your average for-profit illiquid entity. But nonetheless, you know, we do need to, as Tim points out, have some concern for the long-term prospects of the tech campus and the Tech Campus Corporation, which is the owner and kind of the in charge of the administration of the common area arrangements in there. So thank you for your patience.
Okay, the board has a motion before it in draft form by Leah. Two changes have been made to paragraphs 13 and 14, which Leah recorded. Do have a motion to adopt this resolution?
Darren, I'm sorry, before that, I have one question. We've had a great feedback from Chazen and from our team here on what's viewed as lacking at this point. Have these been shared with the applicant for their feedback, or is that part of the formal process when we declare it incomplete?
I don't believe this resolution has been shared. I think they've picked up things as they've gone along, but you raise a point I was going to ask the board about, but I'll ask about now. The applicant, after our initial set of comments, asked to meet with us to review them. And recall, I talked about that last time, and I said, well, it's not appropriate to do that yet until after you've adopted all the comments, and of course the comments have changed and morphed and so on. If you adopt these tonight as you appear, that you're about to, I assume the applicant would like to meet with us to go over them. I would want your permission to do that.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify from a process standpoint.
Right, and the last paragraph of the proposed resolution mentions about providing appropriate notice to the applicant under the SEQA regulations. Your findings have to be provided to the project sponsor. So what we would envision is that the resolution, since it's the easiest thing to share with them, would be the vehicle by which you do that.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. This has been a complex and clunky process, and I think it's important for everybody to have an opportunity to hear and think through these issues. So thank you for that clarity.
Okay. I'm having trouble getting this resolution on the table. Go ahead, Steve.
Recess of the regular meeting or in a workshop, but just to clarify that if you're gonna enter your meeting and, we recess to have the workshop from our special meeting.
Oh, okay. Well, then okay, got it.
So do we need a
All right, the
motion?
workshop can conclude, or at least recess the workshop. Maybe there'll be some more discussions on the workshop after this motion is decided. But for the moment, the workshop is certainly in recess, and we'll recommence the special meeting. And with that recommencement, do we have a motion to adopt this resolution as amended for paragraphs 13 and 14?
I would move the resolution as amended with amendments to paragraphs 13 and 14.
Second.
Discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Okay, so that concludes our special meeting, I think. If we have a motion to adjourn that, we can,
Can I-
we can,
Can I get your permission to meet with the applicant? Is that okay with you?
that's
guys?
fine with me.
Yes.
Anybody else on the board?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I would move to adjourn the special meeting.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. All right, and is there anything else anybody would like to discuss in terms of the workshop?
Well,
think
I mean,
we're probably pretty good.
the real issue is, you know, the full extent of your project as envisioned here isn't gonna fit. And, you know, I don't know what you want to do in here. I still don't know what you want to do. You know, it's going to be with that traffic capacity limitation. You know, what are you looking to do? You know, that, what are you looking to do? Because you know, the idea that you're going to build 10-story buildings in there and you're going to cut into these buffers, you'll never get my support for that. Right? Why are you even asking for it? Because as far as I can tell, there aren't viable projects in this area that necessitate a 10-story building in there and the density of development. I mean, you're ruled out of a lot of that with your traffic, you know, limitations. Why are you even asking us for it? It's making it more difficult to get to yes if yes is possible. That's my own opinion. No disrespect. But that's where I feel we're at.
Okay, any other questions, discussions for workshop? Okay, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your coming. Thank you.